Good morning, good evening. Welcome to AMCHAM's very special fireside chat with Dr. Victor Cha. As a lot of you know, Dr. Cha is a trusted friend of AMCHAM and one of the most well-respected thought leaders on U.S. Korea relations in the world. We're so honored to have Dr. Cha with us today, and I deeply appreciate his time to do this fireside chat with us. As we all know, 2022 has been a very crucial and a dynamic year for U.S. Korea relations. And since the U.S. Korea summit in May, we've had just a lot of optimism for strategic partnerships across sections between the two countries. And sustaining this momentum in this bilateral relationship is so important, as we need more global leadership than ever before. So in this context, super excited to have Dr. Cha with us. I know a lot of you know Dr. Cha quite well, but let me formally reintroduce Dr. Cha to the audience. Dr. Cha is a Vice Dean in the School of Foreign Service at the very famous Georgetown University. He's also a Senior Vice President for Asia and also serves as the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is what I think a lot of us believe as the world's premier think tank based in Washington, D.C. You should also know that in 2021, Dr. Cha was appointed to serve on the Defense Policy Board in an advisory role to the Secretary of Defense. He also formerly served on the National Security Council from 2004 to 2007. He's obviously a true expert. So today, I could not think of a better person to really walk us through all the dynamics between U.S. and Korea and what's happening here in the United States. So for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to moderate a Q&A with Dr. Cha. And then after that, I'd like to open it up to the floor for any questions that you may have. So without further delay, again, Dr. Cha, thank you so much for coming. You're on mute now, so if you could take yourself off of mute. Let's just get to the big elephant in the room. I've been watching the election the past, close to a week now. Your insights are very important to me and the audience. So let's just start off right from the get-go. What is your impression of the current midterm results? I know that the Senate is locked up in the Democrats' favor. The House seems like it's leaning towards the Republicans, and there's a lot of uncertainty still. So we would love your perspective on just that overall election landscape.
Sure, I'm happy to do it. Thanks, James. It's good to see you on the screen, and I'm very happy to be working with AMCHAM. AMCHAM's a very good partner of CSIS and of our president CEO, Dr. John Hamre. And so on his behalf, I also want to send greetings from Washington, D.C., and I look forward to our discussion tonight and the conversation with all the members online. So I think even though the results are not fully known yet, I think we can take a few things away from the midterm results as they stand now. And I should say, I almost forgot, I'm obligated to say that, but that as you would imagine, these views are my own, and they don't represent any organization, university, or the U.S. government, obviously. But I think, you know, the one lesson we've clearly learned from this, and it's no secret to anybody who's been watching the news, is that the big red wave that was anticipated did not happen. As you said, the Senate is now locked up in Democratic hands. We still have the runoff in Georgia, and the House is still undetermined. But even if the Republicans take the House, it won't be by a large margin, and that actually does have important implications. Regardless of who wins, most likely the Republicans will win the House, but regardless of who wins, the margin, the narrow margin of majority actually has important implications for U.S. foreign policy, which I'll which I'd also be happy to talk about. But so that's the first point. The second is that I think there's a pretty vigorous discussion now that this election is a huge defeat for Trump and the sort of Trump America First platform. Many of the extremist candidates that Trump supported did not fare very well in this election, whether it's in the Secretary of States or the governorships or the House or the Senate. Just some highlights in Pennsylvania, we saw Josh Shapiro win over Doug Mastriano, who was sort of an extremist election denier. Fetterman won over Trump-backed Mehmet Oz. In Michigan, Tudor Dixon lost to Gretchen Whitmer, the incumbent who held her position. In Arizona, Kerry Lake, another election denier, was losing. I have not seen any new results today. Unfortunately, I've been in meetings or teaching all day, but she was losing to Blake Masters. I don't know where that is now.
Yeah, she's losing by 0.5% with 93% having been tabulated so far.
Yeah. As we talked about in Georgia, it's very close. Herschel Walker is still in it. And then most importantly, in Florida, Ron DeSantis won by a huge margin in Florida. And as we all know, DeSantis emerged on the political scene with Trump's endorsement in the last election, but this time he sought to avoid that endorsement and has been declared by some, I think, including the Wall Street Journal, as the new leader of the Republican Party and the likely leading candidate for the GOP nomination in 2024. Still, nevertheless, Biden fared quite well in this election. I mean, surprising to most. I mean, I think a lot of people thought that with inflation at a 4-decade high, with rising gas prices, with Biden's low approval rating, and even a very low, a precipitous drop in his approval rating in his home state of Delaware, people thought this was really going to be a bad election for Biden, but he fared quite well. According to the academic studies, the party in power usually loses an average of 28 seats in the House in a midterm election. That's certainly not been the case in this election thus far. And I think Biden himself even claimed he's done better than any incumbent in a midterm election in the last 2 decades. So we all have our theories about why this happened. That the voters didn't vote on inflation, but they voted on a variety of other reasons, including abortion, including just, I think, fatigue from the election denying January 6th extremism. I think I personally think the attack on Paul Pelosi shocked a lot of people, and that might have played a role as well. But those are, so I mean, I'm happy to talk about what I think this means for foreign policy, but James, but that's sort of our first cut.
Well, I think that's a great entree point today, and I have a couple of follow-ups on just the whole election before we proceed to other topics. Obviously, one's about former President Trump. He's supposed to make an announcement tomorrow. Would love your thoughts on that. And the second one was about the polling. Obviously, the pollsters were all wrong in how they viewed it. So what are your thoughts on both those topics, Victor?
Yeah, I mean, so, Trump is Trump, so we have no idea what he's going to say tomorrow. I think most people guess that he will announce, but the picture, clearly has been much more complicated for him, with, Ron DeSantis sort of really emerging as the front runner. Vice President Pence is on his book tour right now, and he's publicly said some pretty clear things putting him in opposition to President Trump with regard to January 6th. And so I think, I think he definitely wants to run. And there may be others in the wings as well, but So I think the picture's become a much more complicated for Trump. On the other hand, there are a lot of Republican insiders who still believe Trump commands, 25 to 30% of the Republican base, and that will be tough to beat if he were to try to put his hat in the ring again. So it's unclear. I'm sure that Trump being Trump, he will take advantage of all the intense interest in what he will say tomorrow night, and he will string it out. Right? He will try to string it out to keep the attention on it. On the polling, yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer. I'm not a polling expert, but the polls have been shown to be wrong lately on many occasions, right? And so I think part of it is that part of it is the sample that they take. Part of it is that there is a silent voting public out there that don't express their views in polls, but that go to the polls. And so, as one pollster said recently, in the end, the only poll that you can read and predict and fill the airwaves in advance of the midterms with all the polls that you want, but the only poll that really matters is the one that happened on election day. And I think that was pretty much the case here. But I would say that in the last presidential election, although the polls are wrong there, but there were people on the inside who were part of Clinton's team that worried, even though that things looked good for her. They were worried. They were not confident. But in this case with Biden, I think I don't think there was anybody that was confident on the inside that he would do as well as he did. And usually there's some contrarian voice to the polls somewhere, but I didn't really hear that in advance of this election. And so that again speaks to, I think how much the issue, clearly the abortion issue, right? Because also fundraising for Democrats went up in the aftermath of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So clearly that was part of it. There were many Democrat experts who were saying that Biden was doing the wrong thing by focusing on defending democracy, talking about defending democracy in this election, and that he should be focusing on gas prices and inflation and those sorts of things. But from what we can tell, based on some of the exit polling, that argument about democracy did resonate, and it caused a lot of people to go to the polls. So Biden, in that sense, wasn't wrong. And then the third, I think, again, is that people are just tired of it. They're tired of all the election denying and the questioning of U.S. democracy and Trump's violation of national security laws and all these things. And I think they were just sick of it, and they came out, right? They came out to vote.
Right. Well, hey, thank you so much for starting us off on the election side. So, assuming that even on a narrow margin that the Republicans take over the House, clearly it's going to be a divided nation. Or we're going to continue to be a divided nation. I believe that there will be a lot more investigations on the Biden administration, a lot of scrutiny on all the different actions that President Biden has taken. So where does that leave foreign policy? China is one. And for us here in Korea, obviously, what happens to Korea is a real big question mark for many of us. So we'd love your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I think you're absolutely right, James, that on the one hand, if the Republicans take the House, there will be investigations of Hunter Biden and, Liz Cheney and others. They will go out and do those sorts of things. On the other hand, I think from a broader foreign policy perspective, particularly as it relates to Asia, I think it's actually good news. And I say that for a couple of reasons. And I say this for a couple of reasons. The first is, even if the Republicans have a majority, they will then choose all of the committee and the subcommittee leadership. it's my estimation that in choosing those people, the sort of America firsters, Trump people will be marginalized. They, if there was a big, so the counterexample, if there was a huge red wave and all of these Trump folks won and the Republicans took a big majority in the House, then the committeeships would look very different. I think they would look very different. A lot of them would sort of go to these America firsters and people who support Trump. I don't think that's going to be the case now. I think, this election showed that those candidates did not fare successfully, and it will put the wind behind the sails of sort of mainstream internationalist Republicans, right, who are who will take these positions. And so these people, I mean, what's important about these people is that they will be very strong on national defense, right, and defense spending. They will be very pro-alliance, right, and they will also be very pro-trade, right, very pro-trade. And so, I expect that that if we do have a Republican Congress, that they will be focusing on these things: a strong defense with an attention to defense spending, pushing for more resources for defense, more focus on the alliances as a central core aspect of the strategy with regard to China, and a trade policy that will push the administration to acknowledge our vulnerabilities as not being a part of, the two major trade agreements in Asia, CPTPP and RCEP. Whether the Republicans win or even if the Democrats somehow win the House, the first main thing is that they will not allow sort of Trump-type people to be dominating the policy discussion and policy formulation and oversight in the House. And so I think that's important. I think a Republican Congress is going to support AUKUS, right? The Biden administration's AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US. They're going to support enhancing extended deterrence to allies like South Korea and Japan. They will also focus on strategic competition with China. And so I actually think it's going to be a good thing. It's going to be a boost to foreign policy. It will definitely push the Biden administration harder on trade. But on some of the other issues, I think they'll be pretty much of the same viewpoint as Biden.
I just learned something really new from you today. The three things you talked about, assuming the House is taken by the Republican Party. You talked about a strong defense, strong alliance, and a more pro-trade environment. But let's just say the Democrats took over the House as well. Does that, have a different impact to these three, criteria we just discussed?
Yeah, I think, James, so I think on the first two, less so. I think on the third, very clearly, right? I mean, the Biden administration has clearly stated on numerous occasions that their trade policy is driven by their labor policy. It's ironic, when I talk to Biden administration officials, they want to know how the region is viewing them on China and on trade. And, I'm happy to have a conversation about how they're viewing them on China, but I can't really have a serious conversation with them about how they're being viewed on trade, because the way they're being viewed on trade is that they're not in the trade game, right? They are not in the game at all. And IPEF still is not really formed yet, so it's not a real solution. And if the administration says, well, our trade policy is our labor policy, that's kind of the end of the conversation. So, don't even ask. Having said that, this election, if the Democrats take manage to retain control of the Congress, that might give the President Biden the confidence to try to do something different on trade. Remember, for the Obama administration, it took a couple of years before they came around to supporting TPP. I'm not predicting that to be the case for the Biden administration, but it might cause them to have a little bit more confidence in terms of having more of a pro-trade policy. But I think it's still going to be difficult. I think, again, Republicans and Democrats are going to support Biden's efforts on export controls. I think they'll continue to support that. But probably the biggest difference would be on CPTPP and RCEP.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those comments. I think, for those of us living in Korea, I guess we should be somewhat happy with the election results. And again, just like you, Victor, AMCHAM is a non-political, nonpartisan organization. So we want to provide as an objective of a factor as possible. So that's our disclaimer as well. So let's talk about, North Korea a little bit, Victor. I know you are also an expert in North Korea. I received several calls from, U.S. multinational company CEOs recently. And this is the first time I've had these calls, which is their companies are asking them, how safe is it in Korea these days? Should they reconsider investments in South Korea? Because all the missile activities, this is kind of unprecedented in a long time. So would love your thoughts on that.
Sure, I'm happy to. I apologize to the listeners. My dog, I'm at home and my dog is barking in the background. I think we're all used to that in the Zoom world. But so the bottom line message is, I think it's safe, right? It's safe. As you remember, we went through the same thing in 2017.
Yes.
When North Korea was doing a lot of missile testing in the first year of the Trump administration, and at that time, people were more concerned about Trump and what the United States might do rather than what North Korea might do. And we can talk about it now. I couldn't talk about it then, but we could talk about it now because it's come out in Bob Woodward's books and in Peter Baker and Susan Glasser's book that Trump wanted to pull American dependence out of Korea, right? That he wanted to tweet that out, or he wanted that to be implemented. Can you only imagine if that had happened, what it would have done to companies and investment in Korea, right? There would have been flight like you could never imagine. My point is that in 2017, North Korea was doing a lot of missile testing, but the concern was not North Korea, it was the United States and what the United States might do, either attack, the so-called bloody nose attack, or pull out, which at that time people didn't know, but it was something that I think many of us were concerned about. This time the questions you're getting, I'm sure the concern is not about Biden, because Biden's about, as an administration, they're very steady in terms of where they stand, but it's really North Korea. And here I would say obviously we should be paying attention, but I would not be concerned that there's going to be a war or something like that on the peninsula, because even as North Korea does all this testing, one of the things that we know for sure is that deterrence is held, right? Deterrence is held since 1953. And if anything, the exercising that we're doing now with the U.S., the ROK, and Japan, shows that the alliance is very strong. So North Korea may continue to do missile testing, but they're not going to try anything across the border. We've had in the last couple of months the release of 4 major national security documents, right? The National Security Strategy from the White House, and then the National Defense Strategy, so-called NDS, out of the Pentagon, the Nuclear Posture Review, so-called NPR, and the Missile Defense Review, so-called MDR. So these, the U.S. government is full of acronyms. The NSS, the NDS, the NPR, and the MDR all are very, very clear about what would happen to North Korea if they tried to instigate hostilities on the Korean Peninsula, or Japan, or the U.S. homeland. And so in the world of deterrence, the best way to deter and maintain the peace is to send as clear a signal as possible that you can. to the opponent, and that's what the United States, what the Biden administration has done with these four national security documents. So yes, of course, there's always going to be concern when North Korea ramps up the missile testing as they did in 2017 and as they're doing in 2022. But I think the important thing is that the United States is steady. Its commitment to the allies are clear, and it's sending a very clear deterrent signal to North Korea.
Yeah, and I think that's a takeaway about what you see the Biden administration doing as it relates to North Korea, which is to be steady, pro-alliance, and not do anything too, out of whack, right?
No, I think that's right. To be steady, to be pro-alliance, to show capabilities, which is what they've been doing with all of the exercising. I think that's very important. But then also to be and to keep the tone down the rhetoric. So you hear no fiery you don't hear fire and fury or a little rocket man or any of these things that Trump used to say about North Korea, which really does inflame the situation. You hear none of that. And at the same time, you hear a willingness to talk, right? The administration has been very clear that they're willing to talk to North Korea anytime, any place, anywhere. Like our friend Sung Kim has said this numerous times: anytime, any place, anywhere. And at the same time, the administration has said very clearly that they're willing to provide humanitarian assistance as well as COVID assistance to North Korea, separate from the missile tests and the denuclearization issues. So it's been, I think, a very steady and consistent message for the 2 years of the administration. And again, I think that's very important. When I talk to institutional investors and others about the Korean Peninsula, it's always triggered by something that the North Koreans do. But the variable, I think for many, the variable is the United States, right? If the United States behaves differently in response to those tests or those actions, that's really what worries people. And again, in response to your question, I think if you track and look at U.S. policy, it moved like this under Trump, right? Fire and fury, then symmetry, then kind of all over the place. But under Biden, it's been very consistent, very sort of steady and consistent. And that's an important thing to place your bets on when you're talking about stability on the peninsula and safety.
And before I move on to this very emotional and sensitive topic called the IRA, let's talk about China-U.S. because I think that's also a big one. Some actually are saying that we're entering the second Cold War, given the geopolitical dynamics between China and the U.S. There's the topic on Taiwan. I know we're having the G20 now as we speak. What do you expect Joe Biden's administration to do as far as China is concerned?
Yeah.
And also Taiwan, right? Because that's the other big question mark.
Yeah. So I would say two things. I don't think this midterm election is going to alter the course of U.S. policy, Biden administration's policy towards Taiwan or towards China. If anything, the Republicans will be supportive or push even harder than the Biden administration on some of these issues. There are clearly two elements of it. One is the focus on Taiwan, where the administration really wants to do more to improve Taiwan defense capabilities. If one of the things that we've learned from the war in Ukraine is that it's hard to win a ground offensive, and it's even harder to do some sort of amphibious invasion of Taiwan. And so they want to build the capabilities to make that as hard as possible for China to contemplate. So that's one element of it. And then the other, much more broadly, is this: what is shaping up to be an across the spectrum peer competition strategy with regard to China. And I think this, this initial announcement of these export controls on semiconductors, but then leaving open, that this could go to AI and quantum computing and biopharmaceuticals and all these sorts of things. This is a version of peer competition strategy across all of these high value sectors that we really haven't seen since the Soviet Union, right? Since the days of the Soviet Union. It wasn't the same sort of competition. I mean, we had comprehensive export controls against the Soviet Union, but it's the same concept, right? It's the same concept to try to do these sorts of things. And I think that will continue in the new Congress, and there'll be support for it in the new Congress, and that will put more pressure on U.S. allies like South Korea. The meeting between, at least the public readout of the meeting between Xi and Biden is about trying to sort of damp down things, like to try to remove this narrative that we're headed to a Cold War with China. I mean, I think both sides are trying to do that, at least in the readout of the meeting. But having said that, I mean, I think a lot of it is just window dressing, and that that they will start to re-engage in certain areas, but these are areas where the United States feels like we need to have cooperation, things like climate change and those sorts of things. But I still think the core dynamic of the relationship is going to remain quite competitive, and that there will be more and more calls for key U.S. allies to come aboard some of these initiatives, that are outside of WTO sort of norms, right? Some of these new initiatives that are, in fact, discriminatory, but part of a strategy that's made to try to protect the United States and prevent China from gaining ground.
I actually read a headline today based on the G20 that talked about how President Xi said he's not going to attack Taiwan on an imminent basis. It's almost like we're going to attack Taiwan, but just not this year or next year. Is that true that they actually talked about that between Biden and President Xi?
Oh, I'm sure they talked a lot about Taiwan. I'm sure they talked a great deal about Taiwan. And I think Biden even said that he didn't think Xi was going to attack Taiwan imminently. I think he said the same thing. There's a lot. So I think at the policy level, U.S. policy on Taiwan hasn't changed. I think it still remains very clearly ambiguous, to use two contradicting terms. I still think it remains like that. At the same time, I don't think the Chinese can ignore the 4 times that Biden spoke about defense of Taiwan in unconditional terms. And I think that certainly irks, if not worries, the Chinese. So, but in the end, I don't think the policy has changed. And we see that every administration official walks back what the president says every time to say that the policy hasn't changed. At the same time, the Chinese know that the United States is doing what it can to help improve the defenses of Taiwan. So it's highly conceivable that they see a window of opportunity with regard to Taiwan closing, right? And time is running out in that sense. Time is also running out for China in the sense that there's an election in Taiwan coming up. I think most people believe that the candidates do not have the same level of experience or nuance on cross-strait issues like the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, who has a lot of experience on this. So I think there's some concern there, both on the part of Beijing and the United States and Washington, D.C. So it would be very good if these meetings do turn down the temperature on Taiwan and get us out of a situation where both sides are at least talking as though time is running out. I think that would be certainly a very productive aspect of this, even more productive than saying, oh, we're not engaging in a Cold War. Because I think on economic policy, we are engaging in a Cold War. But to turn down the temperature on Taiwan, I think would be, even the narrative would be quite productive.
So now I want to talk about the IRA, but for the audience, if we're going to have plenty of time to do Q&A. So please think about some questions and, type the Q&A question, via Zoom. Victor, I've lived in Korea now for 18 years. And in the 18-year period, this is the best I've ever seen between U.S. and Korea as far as relations. There's no more strategic ambiguity. President Yoon, President Biden, they seem like they're really, really locked up in a very strong alliance, and publicly too, right? The only question mark that has entered the fray is the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Clearly, the Korean companies have invested a lot of money in the U.S. I think it's like $80 billion in 2022 alone. But we're seeing a lot of negative emotion associated with IRA. Obviously, it negatively impacts Hyundai Kia. But because it impacts Hyundai Kia negatively, we're seeing strong emotional, reaction across the board, across different industries. Do you see any areas of hope or resolution to mitigate this concern?
Sure. So thanks for the question. And again, I reiterate that these are my own views. They don't represent anybody else. So a couple of things. The first I would say is that the administration, the U.S. government at all levels have heard clearly from the Koreans about this. So there is a lot of attention at the working level and at the highest level focused on Korean complaints about the IRA. So that's the first thing. And that's important. We shouldn't discount that because, at a time when the US is, in a war in Europe and is focused on China and is focused on rising energy prices and all these sorts of things, getting attention on this particular issue at the highest level is no small feat, right? And so I think that's important. The second is that the administration has heard it and they want to try to find a solution. There's often in the US government, you get complaints from allies and you listen, but you don't really try hard to find a solution. You just try to listen and say that you're listening, and then, and that's about all you could do. I think, they've heard it and they're trying to find a solution because, as you said, Korea's been a good ally. It's been a very important ally. And then we have these, not just these huge investments, but huge decisions that have been made by Korean companies to say, I'm putting my high value, high end stuff, in a trusted place like the United States and not somewhere else. And I think that's important. And so, as a bilateral channel has been set up to try to deal with that. That's also important, setting up an actual institution to deal with this instead of it being sort of haphazardly done, I think is very important. So I would say on this issue in particular of Hyundai, I think Hyundai has already announced an earlier start to sort of breaking ground for the plant. There are, as there are requirements in the legislation that even U.S. car companies can't take advantage of because they don't meet the requirements. So they won't get the advantage of the tax subsidies. So one aspect of this is to try to do what can be done to reduce the gap, right? Reduce the number of months that we're talking about where Hyundai might feel exposed, right, in terms of that. And so I think there's efforts to do that. And how that's going to be done, it's not clear to me. Is it going to be legislation? Is it going to be an amendment? And I don't think they're going to reopen the IRA. Maybe they will. I don't know, but that seems like a big lift. Because it's like opening a Pandora's box. So maybe it's an amendment in another piece of legislation. I'm not really sure. Maybe it's something that's done at the state level. to help expedite, Hyundai's building the plant so that, again, they can move more quickly and reduce the number of months of exposure. I just don't know. But the other element of it is on the narrative side. And Jake Sullivan kind of mentioned this when he was initially responded to this, when he said, yeah, that there's some exposure for Hyundai, but on balance, the IRA really benefits Korea, right? And so the other aspect of it is this narrative that, and it's not a fake narrative, it's a true narrative, that there are really some very big benefits that will come to Korea and Korean companies as a result of the IRA. Maybe not immediately in electric vehicles, but certainly in batteries, where Korea will have significant benefits. So the bottom line is, I think that with regard to the cars, that is trying to minimize the damage that's measured in months, from years to months, and then on the positive side, think about the benefits that come to Korea that will be measured not in months or even years, but in decades. Yeah. Right? This will benefit and put Korea ahead of China, for decades going forward.
And Victor, I'm sure there are really good intentions on the IRA, but as you know, one of AMCHAM's missions, besides helping U.S. companies succeed in Korea, is to help make Korean companies invest more in America. And Hyundai Kia is one of those very good examples. So we're hopeful that there will be a good solution that can help companies like Hyundai Kia, and you and I both know the leadership there, and they have done a lot for promoting U.S. Korea relations. And I hope that we can be helpful if that's part of the solution.
Yeah, great. That's good. That's good to know, James. And I know I completely understand that. And I think the Korean companies and the Korean government have done a very good job of making clear what their concerns are. Being a squeaky wheel does help, and so I think that's important. And so I know the administration is very seized with this issue, and they're actively trying to find a solution. Frankly, I think there was a little bit of a gap because a lot of the important decisions on these things were made when Korea was in between ambassadors in Washington, D.C. Yeah. And and I think that makes a big difference too. I mean, we have there's a great ambassador now. Yes. In D.C. We know him well. Ambassador Cho Tae-young is a terrific representative for Korea. And so there was a little bit of a timing issue there as well, but hopefully, it'll be resolved. The other thing I'll say, James, is that, I certainly understand that you've been in Korea for 18 years and that the alliance is about as good as it's ever been. I completely agree with that today. But I will say, in defense of the George W. Bush administration, that at that time, the optics of the relationship were quite scratchy because Roh Moo-hyun was a progressive and Bush was not. But in terms of substance, we did chorus. The South Koreans sent troops to Iraq. They sent PKOs to Afghanistan. We got visa waiver, right, at that time. And then also something called WEST, the Work English Study Program, that allowed students to come to the U.S., a program like we had with Australia, where students could come to the U.S. and on the same visa do work and be a tourist as well as study in the United States. And we got NATO +3 status for Korea, which allowed them to access certain capabilities without requiring congressional approval. So that was a good time too.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you very much for reminding all of us. And I know, Victor, you were a big part of George Bush's administration. So thank you for doing all the great stuff you did, which is what makes this alliance now even more special. Yeah. But we have a few questions from the audience, Victor. And the first question is, the IMF has already forecasted global recession, especially because of the Ukraine situation, the cost of living crisis and the China economic slowdown. Do you foresee any domestic economic and energy policy shifts from the Biden administration?
Yeah, so it's a good question. This is not like I'm in very good contact with the NSC side. I'm not in very good contact with Brian Deese and the National Economic Council side. It's just not my area of expertise. But I do think that, these are, as the questioner says, these are very serious concerns going forward. How much it will shift domestic economic policy, trade policy, or energy policy for the Biden administration, to me, is not clear. I think certainly, there could be more things that will be done in terms of releasing reserves on the energy side, especially when you add the Saudi variable in there. There may be more to be done on sort of releasing of reserves, but I don't have a good sense of where they will make adjustments in their economic policy. Like I said, I don't expect, unless there'll be big adjustments in trade policy, though a Republican Congress might push for that. But in terms of other aspects of domestic economic policy, it's not clear to me.
It's great to see, our good friend Jeffrey Jones, who's really an expert in Korea as well. He has a question for you, Victor. And when Jeffrey asks a question, it's pretty serious. So let's go through this question. So his question is, how serious does the administration and Congress view North Korea as a real threat to the stability of the region?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I do think they view it very seriously. The way they have categorized these things is that Russia is the immediate threat. China is clearly the long-term strategic challenge. And North Korea is the persistent threat. Right? That's sort of the language they use. I have a little bit of trouble with the term persistent threat because it suggests that the threat is there and it's not changing. Sort of like a thorn in your side. It's just there and it's not changing, when in fact it is changing, right? Their capabilities are improving, they're becoming much more provocative, these sorts of things. So I do think they treat it seriously. They consider it a persistent threat. But the question is, like, what else more can they do? And, I think, frankly, they're kind of at a loss for what to do now, because they've already said they're willing to engage. They've already said they're willing to provide assistance, humanitarian assistance, food, COVID support, separate from denuclearization. The one thing that I don't think that they're willing to do is unilaterally lift sanctions to get North Korea back to the table. I just don't think that they're going to be willing to do that. So they're kind of at a loss in terms of what to do now. And, I guess everybody's just waiting for the 7th nuclear test to see if it actually causes the North Koreans to say, okay, we're ready to come back to talks. I will say that the seriousness of the deterrent signal with regard to the threat have been made very clear in these 4 national security documents. I don't know how closely you read them, but the language in them is very clear about North Korea. Really, the language about the end of North Korea if they were to use a nuclear device, or if they were to sell nuclear capabilities or attack the U.S. homeland or South Korea or Japan. It's very clear about that. In addition, there's a twist to this, which is very clear language that the United States does not abandon. I mean, the United States does not accept a no first use doctrine for North Korea. In other words, that the United States reserves the right, if it needed to use nuclear weapons on North Korea. And one of the scenarios which is spelled out in these national security documents, these are all public, so you can go to them and read them, is what is termed opportunistic aggression. Opportunistic aggression. And what that refers to is a scenario in which the United States is fighting a war in Europe. Something happens in the Taiwan Straits, which involves the United States. And then there is another party that engages in opportunistic aggression, thinking that the United States is strapped with two major, military contingencies. The opportunistic aggression language says that North Korea, it doesn't say North Korea, it just says a third party, but a third party should not consider that sort of opportunistic aggression, because the United States will escalate if it needs to deal with that sort of problem. Again, code word for reserving or not willing to accept the no first use doctrine for North Korea. So I do think they take it very seriously as a real threat to stability in the region. I think they do understand, and they see this increasing talk in South Korea about nuclear South Korea or returning tactical nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula. I think they see this. They're watching this. We've just concluded the SCM, the annual big security consultative dialogue between the U.S. and South Korea, where there was a lot of discussion about extended deterrence and the U.S. commitment. So I do think they take it very, very seriously. But again, North Korea is not providing any opening for discussion. The other angle, as Jeff knows well, is you can go sanctions, try to sanction them harder. But at the same time, North Korea is basically closed because of zero COVID. So sanctions aren't going to really work either, right?
So here's a continuation of just a topic on North Korea. The question is, why is U.S. continuing to pursue a policy of sanctions and denuclearization in North Korea when we know that Kim Jong-un would never abandon his nuclear arsenal?
Yeah, so I've seen a number of statements like this that have come out in the press and all this afterwards, that we should just accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state and move on, get on with it. And I have a problem with that, because so the argument is we should just give up on denuclearization and engage with North Korea, lift sanctions and engage with them in arms control and what's known as threat reduction, arms control and threat reduction. I have no problem with arms control negotiations with North Korea. I mean, I have no problem with that. But I would say that I think you can get to arms control and threat reduction negotiations with North Korea without having to accept them as a nuclear weapon state. And in fact, accepting them as a nuclear weapon state has all the downsides and no positive side to getting to a negotiation on arms control and threat reduction. And what I mean by that is, if we accept them as a nuclear weapon state, it will mean the end of the non-proliferation treaty regime. And some may say, well, it's already dead because of India and Pakistan, but that's not true, right? Because India and Pakistan are outside of the NPT regime. They were never signatories to the NPT. North Korea was a signatory to the NPT. They left it, and then they developed a nuclear weapons program. So it's a different case. So it would mean the end of the NPT regime. It would give incentives for others, Iran in particular, to think like, I can do the same thing and get them to accept me as a nuclear weapon state. It would be strongly opposed by Japan, obviously, and by South Korea as well, and probably Australia and UK and France and others. So there's a lot of downside, and it really doesn't buy you anything in terms of the negotiation. If the United States said, okay, we accept you as a nuclear weapon state, and now we want to engage in negotiations on a test ban, fissile material production cutoff treaty. These are the things, if I were to do a negotiation, these were the things that I'd start to put on the table. No transfer pledge, all these sorts of things. My point is, you would be going for the same sorts of things as a negotiator in a denuclearization negotiation. There's no difference, right? I mean, you would be going for the same sort of interim agreements without all the downside of accepting them as a nuclear weapon state. So it doesn't really make sense to me. There's no upside to accepting them as a nuclear weapon state because it will get you the same negotiation that you would get now in a denuclearization negotiation. And yet there would be tremendous downside.
Well, the next question is from my good friend Manohar. He runs base systems. It's about Korea providing military assistance through the U.S. for Ukraine, war. Can you comment on this, please?
Sure. I've been somewhat contrary on my views on this than many of my South Korean friends, including friends in the Yoon administration. I think that Russia cannot win this war, right? I mean, for the sake of everybody and the liberal international order, Russia cannot win this war. It cannot be allowed to win this war. People in Korea might think it's far away and not their concern, but the world would change. In fact, it already has changed with this invasion. And if they were to win, it would change even more. And so they cannot afford to win. And so Korea has a stake in this. If that is not a strong enough argument for Korea to provide lethal, not just non-lethal, but lethal support to Ukraine, the other way of looking at it is that Korea has already joined the multilateral sanctions against Russia. In addition to that, Putin has already said that he's already claimed that South Korea is providing support, arming the Ukrainians indirectly, whether it's through Canada or Poland or wherever it might be. Putin has already said that that Korea is doing this. So if Russia is already sanctioning Korea for participating in the multilateral sanctions, and it's already going to sanction Korea again for providing, they allege, providing support for Ukraine, munitions support for Ukraine, then why not do it? I mean, you're already going to get the blowback from Russia for doing it. So why not do it and actually try to help the international community win this war? There is, you can't be half pregnant on this. I mean, you've already joined on to the sanctions. South Korea has already joined on to the multilateral sanctions. So Russia's already on their side, and now they've already said that they charge South Korea with providing armed support for Ukraine. And they're apparently accepting support from North Korea. So if that's the case, why should the Yoon administration sit idle? They should provide support, and it's needed, right? It is really needed, right? It's public news about the munitions drawdowns, in the United States, and the backlog of orders because for fighting this war. So Korea can make a very important contribution. It fits very well with President Yoon's global pivotal state, his so-called GPS strategy. It would gain a tremendous amount of respect from the Europeans if South Korea did this. It's something that South Korea can do that Japan cannot do, right? It would just be a major statement of Korea as a global power.
So, Victor, we have like a minute and a half left. So 2 quick questions for you. One is a comment on Japan-Korea relations. Is anything ever going to happen in a substantive way? And the last question is about in the event of any instability or possible failure of the North Korean leadership, is U.S. prepared to prevent China from stepping into North Korea? And those are the 2 questions. And I'd like to do it in the next minute or so, Victor.
Okay, sure. So on Japan-Korea relations, I would say continue to watch this space. The Biden administration and the Yoon and the Kishida governments really do want to make progress in terms of improving bilateral and trilateral relations. We saw that there was a trilateral leader summit, another one this week, and then there was a bilateral between Yoon and Kishida. So progress is coming incrementally. I know the Japanese and Koreans are working on a bilateral agreement on some of these historical compensation issues. So I would just say watch this space, right? I think that it may take time, but I think they're working on it. And then on collapse scenarios for North Korea, yeah, I mean, it's something I worry about. I mean, what I worry about, and we saw this when Kim Jong-il died, is that the U.S. government immediately goes into a let's wait till the dust settles mode, right? There's the fog, the fog of war, and let's wait for it to all dissipate before we decide what we're going to do. Meanwhile, the Chinese move quickly, right? The Chinese move quickly. In the case in 2011, 2012, they said to everybody, including South Korea, nobody make a move because we're watching the situation. Greatly offended the Park Geun-hye government, South Koreans, that the Chinese had the gall to say that. So it does worry me that, short of some sort of military collapse and chaos and loose nukes, where I think the U.S. has plans for things like that, when something happens in North Korea, our tendency is to sit back and be cautious rather than being proactive. And China will take advantage of that space.
Well, I know, Victor, our time is up, and I wanted to, again, thank you so much for your gracious time, your wisdom and insights. I appreciate the audience for asking a lot of questions. In fact, we could have handled all of the questions today, but this is available via YouTube. I do consider Victor Cha as one of the real premier experts in U.S.-South Korea relations. And I look forward to hosting when you're back here in Korea, Victor. So thank you again so much.
Thanks, James. Thank you very much.
Thank you.